Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to be talking about articulated 3D prints. Now, we've done a 3D printed fidget toy, and we've done a couple of other 3D print videos in the past, and I think that this is kind of a cool topic, and it's based on a model that I'll put a link in the description. It's based on a model from Jopek Designs that you can find on printables.com. This one is completely modeled by me, but that was the inspiration for this idea. So what we're going to be doing is talking about how to set up articulated print and place 3D models in a very easy way using Fusion. If you want to follow along, you can go to the description of the video and you can download the dataset, Whale Shark. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to look at the model. It's a form that I created. And we're going to talk about how to break it up and what kind of features that we want to use to do a print and place model. Now, I will say that I've printed this out. It doesn't print perfect. It really depends on your 3D print settings because the fins are kind of thin. So you can feel free to play around and modify it as much as you want. But we're going to go through the steps in the process to go from a 3D model like this and how we can break it up, add those articulation joints, and ultimately 3D print it and play with it. So to get started, you want to make sure that you do download the dataset if you are following along. And we're going to begin by editing the form. Now, before I do that, I'm going to go into my bodies folder and I'm going to hide the bodies. Because when we don't do that, when we go back and edit the form, those bodies are going to be transparent or they're going to have like a ghosted image. So for example, if we show this and we edit the freeform model, we can see it on the screen. That could be helpful, but it also can be kind of a pain. So depending on the way in which you like to work, make sure that you understand that hiding those before you go in to edit that freeform model can really simplify just the display and the view. If you're trying to make a slight change to a model, this can be helpful to see, but in some instances, you just don't want to see it at all. So the body was created as a single form. I basically started with a cylinder. I'm not going to walk through the process of modeling it because honestly, it takes a bit of time and it's not really that interesting to me. So what we're going to do is we're going to just walk through a couple of basics if you want to begin to modify this so that you can understand that. And then we're going to get to making our cut surfaces. So again, it was basically started as a cylinder. I built out the body in a low polygon fashion, and then I began subdividing it and adding additional details, things like bevels, so that way I could have a couple of these harder edges just to give it some, interesting features. If you want to build something extremely detailed, you certainly can, but that wasn't the intention here. It just needs to be something basic that we can 3D print. So with the basic model out of the way, I began by creating a plane, and the plane is going to be our cut surface. When we think about an articulating model, in this case, an articulating shark, what we want to think about is the way in which the joints are going to move. Now, a shark obviously sort of wiggles back and forth when the tail moves left and right. So we need the body to be articulating left and right. But we're also going to be making joints that will allow it to move up and down if you want to, just a little bit. So the shape of this is going to be curved in this manner. But from the top, we can play around with it a little bit more if we want to create these cuts in a different fashion. And what I generally will do is I'll begin working with double-clicking an edge, go to Modify Form, and then just begin pulling these out to figure out what I want this initial shape to look like. Once I have that initial shape, I'm going to start by selecting the body. We're going to go to this front view. We're just going to use Control C and Control V to copy and paste. Remember, freeform modeling is direct editing, so we can copy and paste these bodies. You can actually copy and paste them into other files as long as you're in the freeform workspace. And then we need to decide what gap we want here. Now I'm going to make the gap, in this case, 10 millimeters. It doesn't have to be that big, but keep in mind the gap is going to be a direct driver of how much this thing can articulate left and right. If you need it to articulate more, then what you're going to end up having to do is think long and hard about how these cuts are going to work. Another thing that we need to be careful with is the geometry that we're cutting through. Like you can see here that we're cutting through that fin, which means that I probably want to move both of these forward, or instead of making this 10, make it a bit smaller at 8 millimeters, and just kind of play around with and figure out where these can go. So once I'm happy with the gap, I want to make sure that the position is correct. So I'm going to take both of these, and you can use Edit Form to move them. If you select an entire body, it'll default to this body selection filter, and then we can just move them both forward. And what I'm looking to do is make sure that I'm not cutting off too much of that fin, and I kind of want it to be in front of the fin. That looks okay. It'll cut right there, but honestly, it doesn't have to be perfect. And now that we've got both of those, we can just, with them still selected, Control C and Control V, and then we can begin putting them at other locations. I want it to cut just behind the fin, or behind these dorsal fins, or whatever they're called. I'm not a shark person, so I don't know. And I want to make sure that it's coming at the start of this, the fin on the back. We'll say okay. Since we copied those, we can do Control V again, and we can pull them. I want them to be behind the fin now. Now this is going to get a little tricky, and what you might end up doing is manually adjusting these based on the surrounding geometry. We don't want to cut too much, so you just have to be careful in playing around with them. And you can see this one here, that's going to be a problem. So I'm going to manually edit that shape, but for right now, let's just say okay. And then we'll do one more, Control V, and pull this one back, and somewhere before the tail, and make sure we're not cutting that. That looks okay. So once we have that, I'm going to take this top edge and this top edge, and we'll do Edit Form, and I'm just going to pull that top edge forward. Basically what I'm looking to do is not cut into this piece here. There's no reason that I need to cut that out, so as long as I can just maintain somewhat of a general shape, that'll be okay. Now, obviously, if you're creating an articulating model that's not some sort of fish, then you may find that you need to cut them in different ways. There are a lot of different articulating models that you can just download and print. And obviously, the whale shark that's made by Jopek Designs in the description, that one, in my opinion, looks a lot better than this one, but it still gets the point across. Now that we've got these surfaces, all we need to do is finish the form, and we can begin cutting up the body. So we've got essentially these different split bodies, and this is going to take a little bit of time, but what we're going to do is select split body. We'll select the head, or the entire body in this case, and then the splitting tool is going to be this one here. You can extend it out. It honestly doesn't matter because it does cut all the way through the body. Right click and go to the 3 o'clock position for OK. Right click and 12 o'clock position for repeat. This time we're going to select this body, over to this, right click, OK, right click, repeat, and we're just going to kind of work our way through. And you can use the marking menu if you get comfortable, just holding down the right mouse button as you drag to the right. We'll go to OK, and then doing the same thing to the 12 o'clock position. We'll go to repeat last command, and that can certainly speed up the workflow once you get comfortable with using that. I wish we could tab through all the menus in Fusion. That is a gripe that I have. You can tab through menus in Fusion when you are talking about numerical inputs, but you can't do it when you're talking specifically about going through selections. So what I'm going to do at this point is select a body and hit V like Victor on the keyboard, and basically hide everything I don't need, and get rid of that. So that and this one. And the reason I'm hiding those is because now that I have had them hidden, I can go through and just select all the ones I don't want, right click and remove them. So keep it a little bit cleaner. You can rename these if you want. So I'm just going to do body 1, body 2, body 3, body 4, just in case they happen to get out of order. That happens sometimes when you begin combining things together. So it looks pretty good so far. So this is basically going to be the amount of articulation that we can have. So we created an 8mm gap. So it's going to allow it to rotate about 8mm here. And once we add up all the segments, that allows it to curve, pretty realistically. The next thing that we need to do is we need to think about how we're going to create those articulation joints. Now, if you take a look at some models online, there are some really creative ways to do this. But what we're going to do is probably the most simple way that I can think of without having to get real deep into creating some unique geometry. But the basic premise of this is going to be the same. After you make your articulation joint for the front position, all we're going to do is we're going to copy it and position it along the way. In order to do that, I want to start by creating a section analysis at this middle plane I'm going to flip it so it's facing this way. That's going to be important because that way we can see exactly where all these pieces are going to go by turning that analysis on. And the first thing that we want to do here is we're going to go to create and create a torus. Now, when we create a torus, we need to pick the sizes that we want. So for the torus diameter, and let's see, we're going to do 3 millimeters. That should print just fine. And the inside diameter, I think 8 will be okay. And we'll say okay. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to move it. You can use move copy or M on the keyboard. I'm going to bring it forward and then bring it up. You can see at this point, it's really hard to see where it is. So we can turn on the analysis, and essentially this is going to be half of that articulation joint. And what I want to do is I want to put it so that this section here is roughly in the middle of my gap. So kind of in the middle there. At this point, we can hide all the rest of the bodies. We can turn off the section analysis. But basically what we need to do is we need to duplicate this. So Control C and Control V is not going to work like it does when we're talking about freeform models, because we're no longer in direct modeling unless you turn history off. So what we need to do is use move copy, and we're going to select the bodies option. We'll select this body and check create copy. Now, all we want to do at this point, noting that the pivot point is in the middle, if it happens to not be in the middle, make sure that you do set pivot so that way you can put it in the middle. But basically what we want to do is we want to rotate this 90 degrees. And then remember that we set our diameter at 8 millimeters. So we're going to go -4. -4 should put those exactly in line. So this way we've got that articulation joint, and it can be on either side, honestly. If you want to put it on the front or the back, it doesn't really matter which piece of that puzzle is, one side of the articulation joint, which piece is the other. But there are a couple of other things that we need to do. We're going to end up rotating this so it's not sitting horizontal because honestly, it's not going to print very well horizontal. We need to put it at some sort of angle, but we're going to take care of that in just a second. The second piece of this puzzle is we need to create a version of this body that is going to be a cut. It's going to allow us to remove material. Because if we bring back, let's just say the first and the second sections, if we bring these back, and let's go ahead and move both of these, just M on the keyboard, because I opted to put that at the front. I just want to move that around. So if we, if we make this articulation joint how it is now, in some instances, it'll fit just fine. But you can see that there is a small amount, this sort of crescent moon shape here, that small amount that really should be removed from those other bodies. And the way that we're going to do that is by creating an offset. So we're going to take this and we're going to offset it out 1 millimeter, which should be a perfect fit for the sort of the original torus. We're going to repeat that. So right click marking menu and we'll come out 1 millimeter. Let's manually put in 1 millimeter and say okay. Those are both offset surfaces, even though they're completely sealed and watertight. So what we're going to do is select stitch and it'll automatically turn that into a solid. We'll do the same thing here. So now we've got these sort of cut bodies. I'm going to call this one, let's see, cut 1, and we'll call this one cut 2. This is going to be important because once we copy it, those are going to end up sort of carrying that name. So we're going to call this one pivot 1 and pivot 2. Okay, so now we've got pivot 1, pivot 2, cut 1, and cut 2. We want to rotate cut 1 and pivot 1. So select both of them, go to move copy, and here's where we want to make sure our pivot point is in the center of that torus. And we're going to hit the green check mark, and then we're going to rotate these down. So 15, 20 degrees should be fine, but basically what we're doing here is as we're 3D printing this, as we're creating those horizontal layer lines, we want to start this pivot down here. So we've got something to build on. If we had just left it horizontal, it's probably not going to print. It's probably going to fail. But now that we've got these cut bodies, let's go ahead and let's go to a section analysis and let's bring everything back. and we need to copy and paste these 4 bodies. So select them all. We're going to use move copy, create copy, make sure that it's on bodies, and then we're just going to pull this back. And again, we want sort of this, this middle section is going to be somewhere in this gap, but keep in mind that this portion here, that is our pivot. So we've got to just kind of watch this overlap. Now, we could put this further forward because we do have these cut bodies. What we really want to make sure that we focus on is that this pivot piece is able to overlap this body that it's going to. That's going to be a key aspect. It needs to overlap. Even if it's not completely overlapping, it needs to overlap some. So we can pull this a little bit more forward if we want. Let's say here. You can also raise it up if you need to. It doesn't have to be where we put it. It can be, it can kind of be wherever you want it. But I want to make sure that this piece right here is overlapping this. And the big ring is going to be fine no matter what. So this piece here, actually, it looks like we may need to move that one up. So we're going to take those 4, again, move. This time we're not copying. And I am going to just maybe move it up a little bit. Again, what I'm looking at is that circle there, that section of that torus. I want it to overlap this body. And we'll say, OK. Now I'm going to take those 4 bodies. Again, move copy. We're going to create a copy, bring it back. And you may start to see here that things are gonna start to stick out. So we're gonna have to make some adjustments. The way that we did this with this pivot point on the front, in reality, we could flip this around so that this pivot point is on the back. So let's go ahead and rotate it here. They don't need to be the same front and rear. We just need to make sure that we've got that articulation joint in there. So this is possible. We can do this, and that would keep it inside of the outside shape of the model. And then I could take, let's see, pivot 1, and again, move copy to that last section. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this back. Now we're starting to get into some problems where you can see that basically we've got this big section here. Keep in mind that when we're sort of looking at this, the larger body here is the cut body, and the smaller body is really what we want to focus on. So I'm gonna hedge my bets and sort of put it there and hope it works out. If it doesn't, we can always make adjustments. These pivot points don't have to be the same. It's just a little bit easier if they are. All right, I'm gonna do a save as at this point. The reason is this is the sort of the provided file, and I want to make sure that I have a copy of it saved. But what we want to do at this point is we want to start cutting away and then adding. So we're going to do combine. We're going to start with the cut, and the target is going to be the head of the fish, and our tool body is going to be, so we've got pivot 1, which is at the front, and we'd think it would be actually cut 1, but it's cut 2. And the reason for that is because the pivot offset from pivot 2 is what we want to cut away from 1. Make sure we have enough room. So for pivot 1, which is the front, we want to use cut 2. And we can keep the tools if we want. In this case, we honestly don't need them. We'll say, okay. We're going to repeat that. So again, from the back, now we're going to cut away, cut 1. We're going to repeat the combine. This time we're joining them together. So the back and pivot 2, and repeat that, the front and pivot 1. And then let's just take a look at what we did here. So in the analysis folder, I'm going to basically go to create a section analysis from the top plane and start to pull this up. So basically what we did was we built out this section of the design that allows us to print it in place with enough of a gap that they're not accidentally going to get sort of stuck together, and gives us enough room or movement to articulate. Now, there is a lot more that we could do to make this better, but I wanted to go with probably the easiest or the most simple example here, and that's using the two different torus models to make this happen. Now, if you want to spend more time creating a more advanced pivot, then certainly do that, but this is a sort of an easy way to do this on your models. So at the very core of this, this back piece will print just fine because as it's coming up, it'll start to build something it can sort of work on. And we put this at an angle, so it'll start to build this lower section first. At some point, the bottom of this may start to struggle a little bit depending on the speed at which you're printing the material and so on. But for the most part, it does print pretty well as long as you're at 15 to 20 degrees. All right, so let's go back to our section analysis here and let's carry this process on. Now, you don't really need to follow along with this. You can just sort of jump ahead because the process is going to be the same for each body section. Just remember that for this front part, if we're dealing with pivot 1, we've got cut 2 and repeat. And for this one, the cut is going to be cut 1. And then when we repeat, we're going to be joining them together. So those two pieces go together and these two pieces go together. And we'll come back and we can add some fillets and blend things together. But once you understand the sort of nomenclature here, it works pretty well. So this front body, and we switched them around. So now pivot 2 is going to be cutting away from the front. So actually, let's cut that. If pivot 2 is the front, we want to use cut 1. And let's repeat that back here. This is going to be cut 2. And then we'll join them together. So those two go together. And these two go together. And now we got this last one here. So again, cutting away. We're going to look at this body. And that front piece is going to be pivot 2. So we're dealing with cut 1. And then when we repeat it, that back piece, we're going to be dealing with cut 2. And then now we'll join them together. So these two and those two. All right, so now that we've got all of the pivots, we've got to deal with some problems. So the way that we're going to do this is let's start by focusing on just one body. So this body at the front, which has the torus ring in this sort of horizontal orientation, this one's going to be fine. I'm just going to add some fillets to the outside. Let's see if a millimeter will work. And hold down Control and see if it'll let me add it here. Doesn't look like it, so I'm just going to leave a fillet off of this edge. Again, I'm using this torus shape as probably the easiest and quickest way. You could do just a cylindrical revolve or extrusion and just kind of round the corners and be just fine. You may also want to round these corners off if it'll let you, just to kind of smooth the model out. I'm going to leave them sharp at the bottom, but I'm going to add just a millimeter there. And then I'm going to move on to the second one. Here's where we just need to start figuring things out, because if we start slicing this from the side, and I'm going to use a section analysis to kind of highlight this. So if we're going to, let's just go ahead and pick the bottom plane here. If we start slicing this, basically we need to make sure that we have enough of a platform to build out horizontally. So that way we don't start running into issues where the print's going to fail in that point. This part is fine, but what we're going to notice is as we get to some of the other bodies, it's going to start to be a problem. But I'm going to hit F for fillet and just try to add a fillet to blend it here if it'll let me. What you're going to find is sometimes this cut here is going to prevent it from adding a fillet. Sometimes you can get away with a larger fillet, or if you blend all of these together, but sometimes it's just not going to let you. If that happens, what you can do is you can potentially get rid of that and then try to add that fillet there and see if it'll let you. And then in this case, I'm just going to go without that sort of section there. And all I did was I selected it and I used delete, or you can use the delete button here, and it'll just patch it. The main reason that we want to use it is because it allows this piece to go back a bit further, but it's not really required in this case. The other thing I want to do is maybe add a small fillet here if it'll let me. You'll notice that I'm working my way back one at a time. You can try to add all the fillets at the same time, but I find it's a little bit easier to do them one at a time. And I'm going to add it here if it'll let me. So you can see there it doesn't like that section. So we'll say OK, hit F again. And probably because it gets a bit sharp here, you need to add a smaller fillet if it'll let you. In some cases, you can see that it's not doing anything down here. It doesn't like that section. And what that means is potentially we can't add a fillet, or we need to do something a little creative, like do a variable fillet. And what I mean by that is it would be 0 down here at the bottom. And you can see that if we maybe put a point here and try to go to 1 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter, see if it'll let us, and maybe 1 millimeter at the top, and basically just let it blend away. Sometimes when you've got creases on a form body and they sort of transition into other geometry at a star point, we've talked about this in other form content before, but those kinds of things have downstream problems. So having these sort of star points in these corners where we've got a crease go into a smooth section is something I generally try to avoid whenever possible. This one here potentially is not horizontal. It may dip down a little bit. If that's the case, we can cut off a little bit of material, but I think if we can add a fillet here, if it'll let us, let's go back to a constant radius. If it lets us blend that, then that'll be just fine. I'll have enough material on it. And I'll try to add a fillet here as well if it'll let me. And the main reason is just to get rid of those sharp corners. Here, this is probably going to be a problem because of that cut. This cut is actually pretty big, and that's one that we want to keep. But if we just keep adding edges so it has the ability to blend all that together, you can see in this case it works out. So I want to make sure that we have that. This one is going to be tricky. Let's go to a section analysis. This one's going to be tricky because it does drop down. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to give this a little bit of help. So I'm going to start a sketch on this midplane here. We're going to go to Create, Project, Include, and Intersect. And I want to intersect with this geometry, including the fillet and the torus. Don't worry too much about this little cut in there. It's not going to affect what we're doing. But what I want to do is I'm going to take a line and I'm just going to come up to this body here and create a closed profile. And we're going to take this and we're going to extrude it. I'm just going to go out, let's say we're going to go symmetric, and I'm going to create a new body. The main reason that I'm going to create a new body here is because when we turn off our section analysis, there's going to be a little bit of a gap because this thing isn't round. So the reason I did this is because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that new body. We're going to use Move, Rotate, pivot points at the bottom, and I'm just going to rotate it up. Let's go maybe -3 degrees. So now that should overlap everywhere, and I can just join these two together. And that's going to provide a little bit of help getting up to that section. So if we add, let's say, a small fillet here, actually big fillet, 5 millimeters, and then maybe we add a small fillet to these corners if it'll let us. What that'll allow us to do is as we're making that 3D print, as we're building it up, it now has something to support. So let's try to add a fillet here, 1 millimeter, and say okay, and just keep working our way back. Another thing that you can consider or you can think about is breaking this model up as a form. It's going to be a lot harder to do because of the way that these edges are created, but it's not impossible. You could do this as a form entirely if you really wanted to, but I chose to cut it after the fact. I just think it's a little bit easier. So each time I'm doing this, I'm just hitting F on the keyboard, and this is a lot of features in the timeline, which is not ideal, but in most cases, the reason I'm doing this is because it's keeping these features isolated to each pivot point. So I'm not too concerned about the timeline in this case. This one is going to be another one where we're going to have issues because it's hanging down. And let's see if we can add these fillets here. Let it all blend. That looks okay. I'll add a fillet here if it'll let me. Doesn't look like it, so let's try 0.5 millimeter. And then we need to add that little support here. And again, the reason for that is simply because if we're doing a section analysis and we're pretending that we are the slicer, you can see here that a portion of this is unsupported. So unless you want to add supports to your model, then you need to come through and you need to add it manually to sort of fill those areas in. So do the same thing again. We're going to do a sketch, get an intersection of this body. Let's pull it back to the center. Get an intersection of everything here. And in this case, if we don't want to do like that rotation thing, what we can do is we can overbuild this, and let's just come up into the model. The tangency is going to cause a problem, but I'm just going to sort of overbuild this in here. I'm not worried about dimensions in this case. And then E to extrude, symmetric, we'll go out 0.5 millimeter in each direction, and we'll join them together. So that kind of gets away from some of the other issues, but again, it kind of, you can see here it presents a problem. So what I'm going to do is add a small fillet here to try to blend that in, and then we'll add a small fillet here, just blend everything together. And let's move on to the last section, so the last one here. This one, again, we'll try to do a fillet here, see if it'll let us grab everything first and do 1 millimeter. And it works out okay. I don't really care about this little cut here, but if you are worried, you can always just slice things a bit more. Now, I have been adding a lot of features. If you really want to make sure your timeline stays clean, for a model like this, I don't really care. You can add multiple fillets in here just by hitting the plus. If it'll let me do a small fillet here, and then you can sort of just build them up into a single feature. You can do that if you want. I find that's actually a little bit harder to figure out, going back through to figure out which fillet I need to modify, but is basically it. Now we can bring all the bodies back, and now everything should be accounted for. And what we would do from here is, of course, save it. And I'm going to take the entire design and save it as a mesh. I'm going to push it to my 3D print slicer. We've talked about the slicers before. I use the older Creality print for the K1 Max that I'm using. I just find it a bit easier and more simple to use. And then we'll slice it. I've slowed my printer down quite a bit. I've been having some issues with wobble in the X direction. And unfortunately, the only solution that I have at this point in time is to slow it down. It seems to work okay. But we can follow through this model. There are some areas that you can see here. The resolution, because of the curvature, is probably not going to look too great there after it's printed. You can play around with layer heights. I could go down to a 0.1 and try that if I wanted to. But the main thing that we want to look for is when we are starting to build out those pivots, we want to make sure that they're all connected. This one probably is less than ideal, but I think it'll still work okay. And just work through. Now, the first couple were a better solution, but this one here, you can see that it built the platform out, and then now we've got these two little sections, and it sort of works its way back around because of the angle there, and that's okay. And I think that'll work out okay, as long as none of the traces touch. But this one here is maybe a problem because you can see it's starting to build out in space. That may cause us a problem, but it's so minor there that I think it'll be okay. But these are the things that we need to pay attention to when we're trying to do something like this. I think that one looks okay. And the front one I think looks okay too. All right, so again, depending on your printer, you may find that you want to use like a 0.1 millimeter resolution for that instead of the default, 0.1 layer height instead of the default 0.2. I'm using a standard 0.4 nozzle. But now it's time to export it. Whale Shark YouTube, follow along. And then we can take it to the printer and see what this thing looks like. So now we have it printed and everything works just fine. Of course, you can make improvements, you can make adjustments based on your own printer and your own settings. But the main point here is that using just a couple of simple pieces of geometry, in this case, using the torus sort of default primitive shape, we were able to make a print in place articulated design. Now, if you're going to do this on your own, of course, there are a couple of factors that you need to consider. The way in which your design needs to articulate, the orientation during printing, and just also some general ways in which you need to break up your design. And this is by no means the only way to create an articulated 3D print, but this is probably one of the easiest ways to create that geometry just using a couple of simple primitive shapes. Now, if you have any questions on this, please let me know. If you like seeing these types of videos, let me know that as well. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.